Welcome back to our second installment of this Bible study into the book of Ruth. Last time, if you've seen that, we covered the first 5 verses in the first chapter of Ruth, and really what we covered was a lot of background to help us understand this book as we go along in our study. Um, the those things I went back and watched it, and really those things, in some ways, were hard to understand. But I promise you, they'll make more sense as we go along, and we'll add to those things, and I'll point out how those things are important in our story. The yeah, so we read in the first few verses of Ruth how there was a famine in the land, and this was during the time of the judges. The time of the judges was that time period right after, basically from the time that Joshua passed away, and it was a 300-year period of time there when Israel did not have a king. And so there's some things, important things to remember about this as we go through the book of Ruth is that there was no king in Israel, and it was this time of Judges where even the book of Judges describes to us a cycle of the people being unfaithful to God, God lifting His blessing from them, and then they have they would be oppressed by their enemies, and then they would cry out to God for deliverance, and then God would send them someone to deliver them, a judge, and after deliverance, then there would be a period of faithfulness. They would serve God usually up until the point where the judge died, and then they would go back to their idolatry. So it was during that period that this book takes place, and it says that there was a famine in Israel, and so this guy called Elimelech decides that he's had enough of what was going on in Israel at that time, and so he decides to leave, and he takes his wife and his 2 sons, and they move to Moab. Now, Moab isn't really that far away from where they were. They were in Bethlehem, and so they pick up and they move to Moab. Moab's across the Jordan River, then about halfway down the Dead Sea. And there's some things about that that I really drew out last time that I encourage you to go back if you haven't seen that, to go back there and watch it, especially about the inheritance that is the land there. I'm going to build some more on that this week, but when Joshua brought the people of the nation of Israel into Canaan, then God had instructed him to divide up the land according to tribe and family. And so as they left, as Ruth's husband Elimelech left Bethlehem, he was definitely leaving behind the family inheritance. And the most likely scenario is that he had sold that inheritance. And as I pointed out last week, you couldn't really sell the land permanently. You sold it until the year of Jubilee. So that was the value, the amount of money that exchanged hands was, that was calculated into that figure, because the year of Jubilee occurred every 50 years, and the year of Jubilee, the land would revert back to the original family that had sold it. And so Elimelech had left to Moab. He had taken his wife Naomi and their two sons, and they had lived in the land of Moab, and there Elimelech had gotten wives for his two sons. He had gotten his wives from the Moabite women, and so the two Moabite women that he had gotten as wives for his sons, one's name was Orpah, and the other one's name was Ruth. And after a time there in Moab, Elimelech died, and then his two sons died. So that left Naomi and Orpah and Ruth pretty much alone there in Moab. And then Ruth got news that things were going better in Bethlehem, that they had gotten the rain, that it looked like they were going to have a good harvest. And so she heads back to Bethlehem, and her daughters-in-law prepare to go with her. So we'll pick up the story in verse 6 of Ruth. She and her daughters-in-law prepared to leave the land of Moab, because she had heard in Moab that the Lord had paid attention to his people, to his people's need, by providing them food. She left the place where she had been living, accompanied by her two daughters-in-law, and traveled along the road leading back to the land of Judah. She said to them, "Each of you go back to your mother's home. May the Lord show faithful love to you, as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord enable each of you to find security in the house of your new husband." She kissed them, and they wept loudly. No, they said to her, "We will go with you to your people." But Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have any more sons who could become your husbands?" Now, to us, that might sound a little strange that Naomi would ask the question, is it possible for me to have any more sons? And of course, it was rhetorical. Of course, she wasn't able to have any more sons. She was well along in years by now. But the long-standing tradition in that part of the world was that that if a man died without producing an heir, then it was the obligation of the man's brother to marry his widow and to produce an heir on behalf of his brother. This practice was mandated in Deuteronomy. We find that in Deuteronomy chapter 25. I'm reading from Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 5. It says, "When brothers live on the same property, and one of them dies without a son, the wife of the dead man may not marry a stranger outside the family. Her brother-in-law is to take her as his wife and have sexual relations with her and perform the duty of a brother-in-law for her. The first son she bears will carry the name of the dead brother, so his name will not be blotted out from Israel." So the duty of the brother-in-law and the duty of the wife of the deceased man was to produce a son that could carry on the name of the deceased brother if he had not produced an heir to you. And it's all about the land. It's all about the this inheritance that they received, each family received when they came into the land of Canaan. And so it was standard practice in Israel. That was the law, but it's also standard practice long before the book of Deuteronomy was written. Genesis chapter 38, and in Genesis chapter 38, we find the story of Judah and Tamar, and sort of for a time reference, this would be before the exile in Egypt, or the time of slavery in Egypt for the nation of Israel. So, and then Deuteronomy was written after that period of slavery in Egypt, and the period of slavery in Egypt lasted for 400 years. So 400 years at least before the book of Deuteronomy was written, we have this practice recorded for us in Genesis chapter 38. So Judah and Tamar. Now Judah was one of the sons of Israel. In fact, he was fourth son. And Judah had 3 sons by his wife Shua. Now the oldest son was and Judah got a wife for and her name was Tamar. Now it says that was evil, and God killed him. So then Judah gave Tamar to his second son, Onan. Genesis chapter 38, verse 8 says, Then Judah said to Onan, Sleep with your brother's wife, perform your duty as her brother-in-law, and produce offspring for your brother. And as I said, this was at least 400 years prior to the book of Deuteronomy, maybe as many as 500 years, somewhere around there. But long before Deuteronomy, the expectation was that the brother would produce an heir by his brother's widow, and so the first child would be considered hopefully they were always hoping for a son. The first son would be considered the son of the dead brother. Now in the story of Judah there in Genesis chapter 38, the second brother, Onan, he didn't want to produce a son for his brother. And so he avoided making Tamar pregnant. And once again, displeased God, so God killed Onan. Judah's third son was named Shelah. And Shelah, at the time when Onan died, was considered too young to perform his brotherly duty to produce an heir on behalf of by Tamar. So Judah told her to wait until Shelah was old enough. And once Shelah reached maturity, Judah was afraid that if he married Tamar to his son Shelah, that he would die as well. And so he didn't marry them. And so Tamar realized this, and she tricked Judah into sleeping with her. And this was after his wife Shua had passed away. The passage lets us know. But anyway, she dresses up like a prostitute, and they have a night together, and it ends up being Judah who produces twin sons by Tamar. But the point is that even though this is codified in the law of Moses, it was a long-standing practice way before. So it would have been the expectation if Naomi had another son, that he would be first obligated to produce an heir for each of his brothers by Orpah and Ruth. And so Naomi's response to them was very much in keeping with the cultural expectation, letting them know that there was no way that she would be able to meet it. Verse 11, Naomi replied, "Return home, my daughters. What do you want me? Why do you want to go with me? Am I able to have more sons who could become your husbands?" Now, Naomi had been in Moab for at least 10 years, and probably a little bit longer. And so at this point in the story, she's headed back to Bethlehem. But what is she going back to? Okay, the land that was her husband's inheritance was still sold until the year of Jubilee. And we don't know how far off that was. But, it could have been as far off as 40 years away. If the land did not revert back to the family, then who would it revert back to? And as we're going to see here in a little bit, even if that actually without a son or even a grandson, Naomi had no claim to that inheritance. But we know that Elimelech did not have an heir to claim the inheritance. And of course, that's very important because the land was to stay in the family to which it had originally been given. The inheritance was to go to the daughter or daughters if the father did not have a son, but on one condition, that they married within the father's tribe. So the land stayed in the tribe. The land had to stay in the tribe. This is explained in Numbers chapter 37, verse 6. This is what the Lord commanded concerning Zelophehad's daughters. Zelophehad's daughters were 4 daughters of this man that came to Moses, and they said, okay, everybody else is going to receive an inheritance in the land, but we're not going to get one because our dad didn't have any sons. So what can you do for us? And so here's it's found in 2 places. The decision that was made, and this here in Numbers chapter 37 is one of them. They may marry anyone they like, provided they marry within the clan of their ancestral tribe. An inheritance belonging to the Israelites must not transfer from tribe to tribe, because each of the Israelites is to retain the inheritance of his ancestral tribe. Any daughter who possesses an inheritance from an Israelite tribe must marry someone from the clan of her ancestral tribe, so that each of the Israelites will possess the inheritance of his fathers. No inheritance is to transfer from one tribe to another, because each of the Israelite tribes is to retain its inheritance. Okay, so the inheritance would go to the sons first, and if there were no sons, it would go to a daughter, provided that she married someone within that family clan. But do you see that? There's no place here where the inheritance ever goes directly to the widow. If a man dies and he leaves a widow behind, and she has no children, there's no provision of an inheritance going to her. So if a brother or a near relative of the deceased husband marries the widow, then if an heir was produced, the inheritance went to that child. The widow does not have a place in that directly. But Elimelech, of course, he didn't have a son, he didn't have a daughter, and now Naomi's, let us know she's too old to produce any more children. And Naomi is too old, but fortunately her daughter-in-laws are not. Okay, they can produce heirs by a near relative of Elimelech's, but what self-respecting Jewish man, as I explained last week, the status of the Moabites, how they were looked down on. Who would marry a Moabite woman? And so, if there's no heir, then what would become of the inheritance? We find that in Numbers chapter 27. I'm going to read from verse 9. It says, "If he has no daughter, give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, give his inheritance to his father's brothers. If his father has no brothers, give his inheritance to the nearest relative of his clan, and he will take possession of it. This is to be a statutory ordinance for the Israelites, as the Lord commanded Moses." So the inheritance was land, as I explained before. And when I say that, don't just think of a piece of land with nothing on it. Okay, it's included whatever was on the land, and that most likely included houses, and maybe some olive groves, maybe a vineyard, maybe it was good grazing land for sheep or whatever livestock they had. But it would be whatever was on the land when Elimelech's family received it as an inheritance and what they had built since. Most people apparently, when they received their inheritance, they received what was already there when they conquered the people and drove them off the land. Deuteronomy chapter 6 verse 10 says, "When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob that he would give to you, a land with large and beautiful cities that you did not build, houses full of everything good, and you did not fill them with, wells dug that you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves that you did not plant. And when you eat and are satisfied, be careful not to forget the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery." So I'm saying all this to say that the condition in which Naomi and her daughters-in-law were going to Bethlehem in, they were completely without any claim to anything which Elimelech once had. And last week I gave you two parallels between the Garden of Eden and the land of Canaan, and here's another one. So Adam didn't plant the Garden of Eden. He didn't do any work to plant it, to make it how it was. It was already good, but yet he got to eat the fruits of the trees. God said, "You can eat from any of these trees except for that one tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil." So he gets to eat from all of its fruits without having done the work of planting the garden. The Israelites did not build or plant what they inherited, and yet God says that they would eat and be satisfied. So returning to Ruth here, verse 12, chapter 1 says, Ruth speaking to her daughters, she says, "Return home, my daughters. Go on, for I am too old to have another husband. Even if I thought there was still hope for me to have a husband tonight and to bear sons, would you be willing to wait for them to grow up? Would you restrain yourselves from remarrying? No, my daughters, my life is much too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." So as long as Ruth and Orpah uh, are with Naomi, I mean, there's this very slim chance that uh, somehow they might produce an heir. But as Naomi's pointing out, there's no way that she's going to remarry. There's no way that she's going to have more sons. And even if she had more sons, it would take too long, and so on and so forth. And so, but by sending them back, Naomi is forfeiting any chance of an heir uh, in Elimelech's family. But Naomi believed that God was against her. Did you catch that? She says, "No, my daughters, my life is too bitter for you to share, because the Lord's hand has turned against me." Now, as we read on, we'll find out that that wasn't really true. God had a wonderful plan for Naomi, but it sure did seem like it at the time. It seemed that God was against her at this point in time. I mean, she lost her husband, she lost her sons, she's returning back to Bethlehem, but there's not anything really waiting for her there. The future was not bright for her, and definitely did not look like there would be any future for two Moabite daughter-in-laws. Ruth chapter 1, verse 14. Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. Naomi said, "Look, your daughter-in-law has gone back to her people and to her God. Follow your sister-in-law." But Ruth replied, "Do not persuade me to leave you or go back and not follow you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you live, I will live, and your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried." So did you notice the two different reactions? The one of Orpah and the one of Ruth. Okay, now in one way they had the same reaction. They both wept. They both protested initially. And of course that says a lot about Naomi, that both of these women loved her so much. That Orpah dried her tears and kissed her goodbye, while Ruth clung to her. She would not let Naomi leave without her. And this is probably one of the most moving declarations of devotion found anywhere in any literature, and it's here in the book of Ruth, the declaration of devotion that Ruth has for Naomi, a lifelong devotion. So Orpah returned to Moab, and did you see what she returned to? It says that she returned to her people and her God. On the other hand, Ruth refused to turn back. She clung to Naomi. She swore a lifelong devotion. And did you notice what Ruth declared lifelong devotion to? She would not leave Naomi, but she would live with her wherever she lived. But she also swore that the nation of Israel would be her people. She denied the Moabite people and claimed the Jewish people. But even more importantly, she swore devotion to the God of Israel. She said, "Your God will be my God." She denied the God of Moab. It was an oath of devotion throughout her entire life. So even after Naomi dies, Ruth vows to remain until she is buried beside her. Up in verse 18. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped trying to persuade her. The two of them traveled until they came to Bethlehem. When they entered Bethlehem, the whole town was excited about their arrival, and the local women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" "Don't call me Naomi, call me Mara," she answered, "for the Almighty has made me very bitter. I left full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has pronounced judgment on me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" Now, Naomi means pleasant or even beautiful. And she says, "Don't call me pleasant. My life is not pleasant. It's bitter." And she says, "Call me Mara." Which, obviously any of us can figure out that means bitter. She says, "For the Almighty has made me very bitter." And I find that a very arresting statement. God has made me bitter. I mean, it's commendable in a way that Naomi is recognizing that God ultimately is in control. But does God make someone bitter? I mean, isn't being bitter a choice that someone makes? In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 15, we're told, says, "See to it that no one falls short of the grace of God, and that no root of bitterness springs up, causing trouble, and by it defiling many." So Naomi here is admitting to being bitter. She says, "God has made me bitter." But bitterness, as the writer of Hebrews is warning us, is a terrible thing. I mean, circumstances are what they are, but we choose how we react to them. We are the ones who allow ourselves to become bitter. Hebrews says that it causes trouble and defiles many. Interestingly, there's a similar passage in Deuteronomy, and it may be the passage that the writer of Hebrews is drawing from. Now, I'm going to read, it's going to be quite a long passage here, but it gives you the context. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 16 says, "For you know that we dwelt in the land of Egypt, and that we came through the nations which you passed by, and you saw their abominations and their idols, which were among them, wood and stone and silver and gold, so that there may not be among you a man or woman or family or tribe whose heart turns away today from the Lord your God, our God, to go and serve the gods of these nations, and that there may not be among you a root bearing bitterness or wormwood, and so it may not happen when he hears the words of this curse, that he blesses himself in his heart, saying, I shall have peace, even though I follow the dictates of my heart, as though the drunkard could be inclined to be sober. The Lord should not spare him, For then the anger of the Lord and his jealousy would burn against that man, and every curse that is written in this book would settle on him, and the Lord would blot out his name from under heaven. So here, a root of bitterness that they're being warned against would turn a man's heart away from God and turn him towards idolatry, cause him to become cynical and say, none of these things are going to happen to me. I shall have peace, even though I follow the dictates of my heart. As though a drunkard could be included with the sober. Excuse me. So I do not think that that is where Naomi was just yet, but she was definitely laying the blame on God. God has made me bitter. And so that's the state that Naomi and Ruth are coming to Bethlehem in. They have no claim to an inheritance. Not really much hope that there's an heir that's going to be produced that could inherit the inheritance of Elimelech. So that property is going to go to the nearest relative. And so chapter 1 ends with this. So Naomi came back from the land of Moab with her daughter-in-law Ruth the Moabitess. They arrived in Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. And so we will return to talk a little bit more about that. I talked about that last week, but I think I could make it a little bit clearer what exact time they are returning to when it says that they returned at the beginning of the barley harvest. Let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father God, thank you for your word. We thank you for your instruction from Ruth, and Lord, may we learn from it. I pray your blessing on us as a church as we go through this week. Pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.